Dark clouds cloaked the sky above King's Landing, pregnant with the promise of a storm that refused to break. The once proud city still bore the deep scars of recent battles. Charred rubble and collapsed towers told stories of dragonfire and desperation. Yet life crawled onward among the ruins. Merchants still hawked their wares in half-standing markets. Children still chased one another through dusty alleyways. And nobles still debated which banner to rally behind, which ear to whisper in. All of them kept glancing upwards, afraid they might hear the dreaded roar of dragons once again. Rumors had already begun to spread that 2 of the great beasts had survived the inferno, that even death by war couldn't claim them fully. But these whispers remained just that, frightened mutterings in dark corners. Daenerys Targaryen had paid for her conquest with more than coin. She had lost armies, allies, and very nearly her mind. Only the unwavering presence of Drogon by her side, as well as the faint hope that Rhaegal and Viserion might yet draw breath, kept her going. The nights were worst. When she managed to close her eyes, even for a moment, she would dream of the bells, the shrieks of the dying, and the thunder of collapsing buildings. She would awaken sweat-drenched and trembling, her first impulse always to rise and check on Drogon. He had been her solace in this new age of guilt and suspicion. Still, she could not forget the other 2. Perhaps it was the motherly instinct that had bloomed when she first birthed them in fire, or perhaps it was just desperation for an unbroken family. But she would lie awake and listen for the distant cries of dragons, hoping that they would come home. She stayed in the Red Keep, or rather what was left of it. The portions that had not collapsed were still structurally unsound, requiring the labor of thousands to rebuild. With the Iron Throne melted into a twisted shape of black slag, the grandest hall in Westeros was a broken relic of her own wrath. Daenerys had no illusions about her reign. She knew that even though she wore a new crown forged quickly by loyal smiths, its silver arcs cutting a simpler silhouette than the Baroque spires Cersei had loved, she was no queen in the minds of many. She ruled through fear as much as any other tyrant might. She felt the stares of those who bowed to her, heard the hush that fell when she walked by. Everyone remembered how she had unleashed Drogon upon the city. The mother of dragons had proven merciless, and the people were left to pick up the pieces. But she told herself it was necessary. Revolutions were never gentle. On the balconies at dawn, Daenerys sometimes stood with the breeze catching her silvery hair, her eyes scanning an ash-coated sky, half hoping to see a glimpse of emerald or pale gold wings. She prayed that she might see Rhaegal or Viserion soaring across the horizon, returning to her side at last. But they never came. Nor did she find any trace on the battlefield that suggested they had truly perished. There were stories that Rhaegal's limp body had fallen into the bay, or that Viserion, once resurrected by the Night King and then freed upon his defeat, had disappeared into the far north. So many rumors, so little truth. Sometimes, in her weaker moments, Daenerys felt she could sense them as she did in the earliest days of their births. A hum of energy through her blood, a faint knowledge that they were out there. Alive. Word eventually reached her of sightings beyond the neck, near the haunted ruins of Moat Cailin. A wandering band of scavengers claimed to have seen 2 dragons, locked in a furious battle with each other, or perhaps in a savage hunt for some great beast. Their descriptions were uncertain, but in broad strokes they told of green scales flecked with gold, and the pale body of a once-dead dragon, now very much alive. It made no sense. Rhaegal had never been described as flecked with gold, and Viserion, after he had been turned by the Night King, was said to have lost much of his original coloration. But then again, so much about dragons defied logic. Excitement swelled in Daenerys's chest. She summoned her advisors and demanded more. If her children were alive, she would find them. She was the breaker of chains, the Khaleesi of the great grass sea, the mother of dragons. She had walked into fire for them once. She would do so again if it meant reuniting the family she had started with 3 small eggs. Yet the court advisors gathered in the crumbled throne room were not so sure. Sir Davos, who had become one of her most pragmatic counselors, counseled caution. "If they are out there," he said, voice rough with the brand of honesty that often grated on Daenerys' temper, They have survived a horror show of war and magic and betrayal. They might not be in any mood to be tamed again." Tyrion, standing behind Daenerys' right shoulder, pressed his mouth into a line and nodded softly. "Dragons bond for life. That much is true," Tyrion said. "But men can be changed. So can beasts. Need I remind you of what happened with Viserion beyond the wall?" Daenerys bristled. She could feel the tension that always churned in her belly when someone brought up the army of the dead, or the way that monstrous shadow of Viserion had burned the wall with an unnatural blue flame. She had believed that once the Night King was destroyed, Viserion was free from that dark magic. But the memory of his rotted visage, the holes in his wings, the terrifying screeches that pierced the northern sky, those images still haunted her. The question remained: if Viserion had indeed survived in some twisted half-living state, would he ever be the same? She hoped that her bond with him lingered. She hoped the warmth of his first days out of the egg would still mean something. Because if not, it would mean facing something horrifying: the knowledge that one of her children had well and truly turned monstrous. "Fetch me the best trackers," Daenerys finally said. "We will find them, and I will bring them home." The next day, before dawn, she departed for the north. She left a skeleton crew of Unsullied to guard King's Landing, and Grey Worm to ensure that no one tried to grab power while she was gone. Tyrion accompanied her, despite her earlier misgivings about his loyalty, for she could not fully trust him, yet she could not fully do without him either. He had a clever tongue and an extraordinary mind. If it came to bartering for the loyalty of half-savage clans in the Neck or negotiating safe passage through the ruins of Moat Cailin, she wanted him close. Sir Davos, who had never pledged himself fully to her, but who had thrown his lot in with her after all other roads led to dust, also joined, if only to keep the peace. A small retinue of Dothraki riders, a handful of Unsullied, and a wagon of provisions set forth. At the head of the column, Drogon soared overhead, occasionally letting out a roar that echoed across the plains. Perhaps he too longed for his lost siblings. The journey north was a grim reminder of the war's devastation. Villages lay in heaps of rubble, blackened skeletons of houses and barns. The fields were scorched, and many of the small folk who recognized Daenerys' approach fled inside whatever meager shelters they could find. She saw in their eyes a fear that stung her soul. She had wanted to be a liberator, but had become something else. Had she truly freed them, or merely exchanged one chain for another? She pressed onward, determined that once she was reunited with Rhaegal and Viserion, she would find a way to rule that might grant her redemption. Or so she told herself in her lonelier hours. A fortnight later, they reached the Neck, that narrow and treacherous stretch of land separating the north from the south. The bogs and marshes gave off a perpetual mist, and the ground was slick with mud and hidden sinkholes that could swallow a man whole. Dothraki horses grew restless in such a climate, and more than one rider cursed under his breath about the swamp and the biting insects that swarmed them at dusk. Tyrion observed their progress from the seat of a covered wagon, noting that the further north they traveled, the more rumored sightings they heard. The local marsh folk swore they had seen 2 dragons swoop down upon a herd of deer near Twilight's Rest. Others claimed the dragons roosted in the ruins of Moat Cailin itself, the ancient fortress built to keep out southern invaders. None could say precisely when or where they might appear, only that they had indeed been seen. Moat Cailin rose from the mist like a rotted skeleton of stone, half-crumbled towers leaning precariously over the watery marsh. The causeway leading into it was pitted with collapsed sections of walkway, forcing Daenerys' party to pick their way carefully. Drogon flew overhead but let out a frustrated groan, as though he too found this place unsettling. When they finally entered the ruined fortress, they found it empty of any sign of living men. Slime covered old battlements, and the wet wind carried a stale odor of neglect. Moss and tangled weeds clung to every surface. Daenerys dismounted, her leather boots sinking into muck, and stepped forward. She felt a pulse in her chest, an odd tightness. Perhaps it was only the chill wind off the bog, or perhaps it was some intangible call she felt from her missing children. She put a hand on Tyrion's shoulder to steady herself. His sharp eyes scanned the gloom. They explored the fortress for a day without encountering more than a handful of wild animals, and the skeletons of those who had died here long ago. But late that evening, just as a heavy fog rolled in from the west, a roar split the air. Drogon answered at once, rearing up on his hind legs, wings spread wide. Daenerys' heart leapt into her throat. Torchlight flickered on the ancient stones, and the bog shimmered as something vast flew overhead. The watchers on the wall pointed. Then they saw it, a shape with wings torn and ragged, but undeniably a dragon. Its roar was like no living thing Daenerys had ever heard. It was layered with a hollow resonance, an echo of something that should have stayed dead. Viserion eyed. She knew it at once. Her eyes welled with tears. She called out his name with a trembling voice, ignoring the fear in the eyes of the men around her. Drogon took to the air, wings thrashing the mist. For a moment, the shapes of the two dragons coalesced into silhouettes against the moonlit sky. A black monster, larger than any living dragon the world had seen in centuries, and a pale, spectral sibling. An unearthly shriek came from Viserion's throat, and Daenerys felt her blood run cold. Memories of the night King's abomination flashed in her mind. Viserion's decaying body letting loose a torrent of blue flame that had brought down the wall. But had he truly been freed from that curse when the Night King fell? Or did some remnant of that vile magic still cling to him? The dragons clashed in a flurry of snapping jaws and whipping tails, but it was more a brief exchange of recognition than a true fight. Then, with a frantic beat of wings, Viserion spun away, vanishing back into the night. Drogon followed, roaring as if demanding that his sibling return. Daenerys ran along the crumbling battlements until her boots slid on mossy stones. She strained her eyes, but the fog swallowed both dragons. For several minutes, all they heard were distant screeches and growls. Then silence. Daenerys sank to her knees, heartbreak and hope colliding. If Viserion was here, truly here, then perhaps Rhaegal was not far behind. A weary hush settled over the company. They set up camp inside the old fortress, building fires within half-collapsed halls, wary of the bog snakes and lizard lions that supposedly lurked in these waters. Daenerys could not sleep, her mind haunted by the glimpse of Viserion's ragged form. Tyrion and Davos tried to keep her spirits up, reminding her that the bond might still exist if Viserion had recognized Drogon. But Daenerys lay awake by the biggest fire, listening to Drogon's restless snarls echoing in the darkness beyond the walls. Before sunrise she was awakened by shouts from the men. She leapt up, clutching her fur-lined cloak, and rushed out to see what was happening. There, perched on a broken tower, was Rhaegal. He was weaker, the lines of his body gaunt. A jagged scar ran along his flank where he had been struck by scorpion bolts in the assault on King's Landing. Yet his eyes glowed with feral intelligence, and when Daenerys stepped forward, hands outstretched, she felt his breath ripple through her hair. He let out a low rumble, cautious, uncertain. She spoke to him in Valyrian, words of comfort, of kinship. She could see the flicker of recognition in his gaze. Her heart soared. Then, with a sudden, swift movement, Rhaegal opened his jaws, releasing a warning gout of flame that singed the stones before her. Guards leapt to protect her, but she waved them away. Rhaegal didn't attack again, yet he was clearly not ready to be touched. His wings spread with a snap, and he took flight, heading north over the bog. Drogon emerged from some hidden perch to follow, as if torn between protecting Daenerys and reuniting with his siblings. The swirl of fog soon hid both dragons from sight once again. All day they waited, scanning the skies, searching the marshes, calling out in vain. The men whispered that Daenerys' dragons had grown wild, that maybe they wanted no part of her anymore. Some told stories around the fires at night of how dragons in the old days would sometimes abandon weak riders, or turn savage if they sensed their humans' vulnerability. Daenerys ignored the talk, but it burrowed into her mind nonetheless. She remembered how the Dothraki first tested her strength by walking into her tent unbidden. She had proven herself with dragonfire and a fearless heart. Did these dragons now doubt her the way her own subjects did? Did they feel the same suspicion that half of Westeros held in their hearts? They pushed further north, through the Barrowlands and into territory that had once belonged to House Stark. The chill in the wind grew more pronounced, and even the Dothraki wore heavier furs, muttering curses at the biting cold. Daenerys pressed on, scanning the skies for any sign of her dragons. Drogon appeared sporadically, keeping his distance. Sometimes he would circle overhead, then dart off as though answering some call she could not hear. It became clear he was seeking out his siblings. Each night, Daenerys prayed for them to reunite as a family. Each morning, she woke to find only emptiness. At Winterfell, they found the fortress in the early stages of rebuilding. The great northern seat had been battered by the war against the dead, then partially ransacked by opportunists in the aftermath. Yet the ancient wall still stood, a testament to the resilience of the north. The few lords who remained loyal to Daenerys after the wars greeted her with mixed courtesy. Some had hoped she would remain in King's Landing, far away from them. Others saw her arrival as an opportunity to curry favor. She was the queen now, after all, and she still had the living dragons to prove it. Daenerys cared little for their politicking. All she wanted was information. At first, the Northerners had nothing to offer her. No sightings, no fresh rumors. But then, an old man who served as a stable master spoke of a monstrous shape seen flying over the mountains to the west. He claimed it was accompanied by a second shape, smaller and pale as bone. Daenerys' heart skipped. Rhaegal and Viserion were traveling together. Whether they were forging a new bond or fighting, the man could not say. They had vanished into a snowstorm in the high passes. Daenerys wasted no time. She assembled her retinue and departed Winterfell the next day, ignoring the lords who wished her to hold court. Tyrion grumbled about ignoring politics, while Davos quietly admitted he had no desire to linger among northern lords, who still held Stannis' demise and the entire war in bitter memory. The mountains west of Winterfell were savage, with snowdrifts that could swallow a horse. The party struggled, losing 2 men to an avalanche that thundered down a hidden ravine. The Dothraki fared the worst, their horses ill-suited to the freezing temperatures, and one of them came down with a fever that left him delirious. Daenerys urged them onward, offering whatever meager comfort she could, but in truth, she felt her own strength flagging. She had dreamed of finding her dragons in a triumphant reunion. But this wilderness tested her resolve. More than once she wondered if it would claim them all. Then, on a dark, storm-lashed afternoon, they arrived at an ancient ruin perched on a rocky slope, a small castle built centuries ago and long since abandoned. Its walls were half collapsed, but it offered some protection from the ceaseless wind and the swirling snow. Daenerys led her party through a broken gate, into a courtyard choked with debris and wild winter shrubs. High above, she saw the silhouettes of 2 dragons crouched upon the remains of a crumbling tower. One was large, green, scarred, but unmistakably Rhaegal. The other was Viserion, whose color had grown pallid, and whose wings bore tears that glowed faintly with an eerie light whenever lightning flashed across the sky. A lump formed in Daenerys' throat. She dismounted and approached on foot, alone, not caring that the wind whipped at her furs or that her cheeks stung with cold. She had raised these creatures from eggs, had fed them raw meat with her bare hands. She had soared on their backs through the skies of Essos, blazing a path to free countless slaves. She called out their names now, her voice carrying over the roar of the gale. At first, they did not stir. Then Viserion moved, shifting his massive head toward her. She saw, to her horror, that his once bright eyes were cloudy, shot through with filaments of unnatural ice blue. She recalled all too well the dreadful hue they had taken when he was the Night King's steed. She prayed that was gone. Perhaps it was not. Viserion, she said softly. My son, I am here. The Night King is gone. You are free. The dragon made a sound that was part snarl, part wail, as though torn between instincts. Rhaegal stretched out his neck, his nostrils flaring, testing the air that carried Daenerys' scent. Lightning split the sky, revealing the gaunt hollows beneath Rhaegal's jaw, the old wounds that had never fully healed. The 2 siblings regarded their mother from high on the tower, wings partially unfurled. Tyrion and Davos watched from a safe distance, unsure whether they should draw weapons or flee. Daenerys edged forward, ignoring every bit of fear that gnawed at her. She recalled how she had once chained her dragons beneath the Great Pyramid of Marine when she feared their growing aggression, and how that act had strained her bond with them. This time, she would offer no chains, only open arms. Perhaps that would be enough. Then, without warning, Viserion dove off the tower. He descended in a rush of wind, landing heavily on a mound of shattered stone, just a dozen yards from Daenerys. His body looked whole in places, decayed in others, as though the necromantic forces once used by the Night King still lingered. He opened his jaws, releasing a roar that made the ground tremble. Daenerys braced herself, tears freezing on her lashes. Carefully, she approached, step by step. Rhaegal remained perched above, watching, tense. When she was close enough to feel the heat of Viserion's breath, she stopped. She spoke in a soft, sing-song manner, words of old Valyria, words of comfort she had once whispered to them as hatchlings. Viserion trembled, tail lashing. Then, with a mighty exhalation, he unleashed a torrent of flame. But it was tinged with some strange glow, a mixture of living fire and that icy magic he had inherited from Undeath. Daenerys dove aside, rolling across the broken stones. The heat and cold clashed at once, turning the air into a swirling mass of sparks and frost. A chunk of the castle wall behind her exploded into molten rock and shards of ice, the collision of opposing energies. "Your Grace, get back!" Davos shouted, starting forward, but Tyrion held him in place. Drogon swooped in from the storm above, colliding with Viserion in an explosion of scales and fire. Their roars shook the ruin. Daenerys scrambled to her feet, shouting for them to stop. Drogon tried to pin Viserion down, but Viserion twisted with unnatural agility, lacerating Drogon's flank with claws that glowed with some leftover sorcery. Rhaegal joined the fray, smashing into both of them, snapping at Drogon as though furious at the intrusion. It was a nightmare. The three siblings tore at each other, raining shards of stone upon the trembling humans below. Daenerys felt as though her heart was being ripped apart. She had never seen them fight in such a way. True, they had squabbled over food in the past, but this was a savage battle for dominance. Why? Had her actions in King's Landing broken the trust they had once given her unconditionally? Had the resurrection of Viserion corrupted them both, leaving Rhaegal distrustful of all? Or was it simply the way of dragons, that once grown, they might not acknowledge the same motherly bond as before? Lightning illuminated the swirling chaos. Drogon's black scales glimmering with fresh blood, Rhaegal's savage green hide streaked with old scars, Viserion's pallid form flickering with unearthly energies. They crashed into one another, roars echoing like thunder, snapping at each other's throats. Over and over, Daenerys cried out, until her voice was hoarse, tears and freezing rain streaking her cheeks. Then, in a single explosive moment, Viserion struck Drogon with a blast of that half-frozen, half-fiery breath. Drogon roared in agony. Rhaegal, taking advantage of Drogon's pain, raked his claws across Drogon's side. The black dragon tumbled, slamming into the remnants of the tower. Stones collapsed onto Drogon, pinning him momentarily. Daenerys watched in horror as Rhaegal turned his gaze toward her. The look in his eyes was something she had never seen before. A deep, primal resentment, not mere animal rage. Viserion, wounded and panting, approached from the side, his head lowered. Together, the two advanced on Daenerys, ignoring the men who watched in terror. She took a faltering step backward. A part of her wanted to stand her ground, to maintain the dignity of a queen and mother of dragons. But the instinct to live was fierce. She glanced behind her, saw no quick escape in the rubble. Tyrion and Davos were yelling, ordering the men to form up, though what they could do against two angry dragons was negligible. Just then, Drogon heaved himself free of the broken stones, ignoring the fresh wounds that bled bright red in the flickering light. He roared, a challenge that reverberated through every stone of the castle. For a moment, all three dragons froze. Then Drogon unleashed a fierce column of living fire at Rhaegal. The green dragon roared in pain and fury, rearing up. Viserion countered with his twisted breath at Drogon, forming a swirling vortex of steam and sparks where the flames collided. Stones melted and froze and shattered in the blink of an eye. Daenerys watched helplessly as the fury of the dragons threatened to bring the entire ruin down around them. Rhaegal shook himself, scorched but still alive. He spread his wings wide, turning to Viserion as if in silent communication. Then both dragons darted away from Drogon, taking flight in the howling storm, the beating of their wings stirring gusts of wind that nearly toppled Daenerys. She shielded her face from flying debris, and when she looked up again, Rhaegal and Viserion were gone, swallowed by dark clouds. Drogon gave chase, his roar echoing into the distance, leaving Daenerys alone with her terrified companions in the wrecked courtyard. For a long time, there was no sound but the crack of thunder and the hiss of sleet. Daenerys stood in the middle of the destruction, heart pounding, limbs shaking. Tyrion and Davos slowly approached, each uncertain how to comfort a queen who had just been spurned and nearly killed by her own children. "What do we do now?" asked Davos quietly. Daenerys shut her eyes, tears mixing with the freezing rain. "We follow them," she whispered. "They will not deny me forever. They are my blood, my children." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. It had been easy once, when they were hatchlings, no larger than cats. They had recognized her as mother then. But now, after war and death and the corruption of magic, the bond might be fractured beyond repair. For the next several days, they tracked the dragons by rumor, by the scars left upon the land, by fresh footprints in melting snow. It became clear that Rhaegal and Viserion had begun hunting in tandem, an uneasy alliance between them that drove entire herds of elk across the mountains in terror. Some of the local mountain clans told of seeing ghostly fires in the sky at night, as though the dragons were locked in an aerial dance of violence and power. Daenerys' own small force was dwindling. The Dothraki longed to return to warmer lands, grumbling that these dragons were clearly no longer loyal, and that a Khaleesi who could not rule her own beasts was cursed. The Unsullied did not complain. Obedience was their way. But she could sense their disquiet. Food supplies ran low, the cold bit harder, and the men's morale sank. Drogon returned only sporadically, always battered by new wounds. Each time, Daenerys tried to tend him, coax him to stay. But each time, he left again, as though compelled to chase Rhaegal and Viserion. Daenerys feared Drogon would be killed in a final, fatal conflict, if she could not find a way to mend the bond or stop them. She knew she had to try something drastic. Her mind turned to the old ways of Valyria, the blood magic that might restore a bond with a rebellious dragon. It was a dangerous path. She had known witches and warlocks, and she still bore the scars of their treacheries. Yet a mother desperate to save her children, and herself, might well consider anything. Tyrion, when she confided her thoughts, paled. "Blood magic has never ended well for us," he murmured. "Ask yourself, is the risk worth it?" But Daenerys was already sliding into the mindset of absolute necessity. If she could not bring Rhaegal and Viserion back into the fold, she would never truly be safe, and Westeros would remain under the shadow of monstrous dragons that owed no fealty. Worse, they might ally with her enemies. The lords who despised her might try to lure Rhaegal and Viserion with fresh cattle and cunning sorcery. Dragons had their own minds, but Daenerys knew the cunning of men. She would not let her children become weapons against her. In secret, she summoned a sorceress from the remains of Essos, a woman rumored to have studied under the Red Priests of Volantis, as well as the Shadowbinders of Asshai. Her name was Tasha, a tall, gaunt figure draped in tattered crimson robes. She arrived under the cover of darkness, slipping into Daenerys' makeshift camp in the mountains. Tyrion and Davos watched warily as this woman knelt before Daenerys, hailing her as the mother of dragons. Daenerys sensed the woman's power, a faint aura of heat and danger that set her nerves on edge. She commanded Tasha to speak plainly. Could the bond with two rebellious dragons be restored by magic? Tasha's eyes gleamed like hot coals. "Much is possible in the realm of fire and blood, your grace. But be warned, The price is rarely cheap. Daenerys hardened her heart, recalling how Mirri Maz Duur's blood magic had once cost her unborn child's life. But that had been a lifetime ago, and she had learned much since then. "No lives will be taken," she said. "I forbid it." Tasha inclined her head. "There are many ways to pay a blood price. Not all require human sacrifice." "Men?" Despite her misgivings, Daenerys pressed forward, desperate. Tasha asked for a private place of ritual, a cave or a sealed ruin, where a fire could burn uninterrupted, fed by the blood of the queen and the tokens of the dragons. Daenerys gave the command, and scouts found a small cavern not far from their encampment. By torchlight, the queen and a handful of chosen companions, including Tyrion and Davos, followed Tasha into the depths. There, in the flickering gloom, Tasha drew strange glyphs on the stone floor, mixing dragonbone ash with the queen's blood from a shallow cut on her forearm. Daenerys winced but remained resolute. She had to believe that this was a last resort, the only method to save her children and unify them under her banner once more. Tasha chanted in a low, rasping tone, weaving a tapestry of words in High Valyrian and some darker language that made Tyrion's skin crawl. Daenerys stood in the center of the glyphs, eyes closed, letting her mind drift back to the moment she had hatched the eggs in Drogo's funeral pyre. She remembered the heat of the flames licking at her skin, the ecstasy of new life unfolding from the eggs. In that moment, she had felt something cosmic, as though her own soul had intertwined with the dragons. Tasha's chanting rose in pitch, and Daenerys felt a warmth spreading through her chest, the same heat she had felt in the flames. But then, as Tasha's chant reached a crescendo, Daenerys felt a surge of agony. It was as though her very blood was boiling. She screamed, collapsing to her knees. Tyrion and Davos rushed forward, but Tasha hissed for them to stay back. The glyphs on the floor began to glow, lines pulsing with Daenerys' blood. Daenerys gasped for air, her mind overwhelmed by visions. She saw Rhaegal tearing across a burning field, devouring soldiers who wore the insignia of a dragon, her own men. She saw Viserion unleashing that twisted flame upon droves of terrified smallfolk. She saw Drogon lying broken, his black scales charred and frozen. She saw a future in which the realm was scoured by dragonfire and dragon frost, leaving nothing but ash and cinders. She forced herself to focus, to hold on to the memory of love she had once shared with her dragons. A mother does not forsake her children. Tasha's voice echoed in the cavern, weaving magic through the air. Daenerys grabbed the knife near her, pressing it to her palm, letting fresh blood flow into the glyphs. "Come to me," she whispered. "Rhaegal, Viserion, not my children. Feel my blood. Remember our bond." And now, the air shuddered, and a roar sounded from somewhere deep in the mountains. Another roar answered it. The glyphs flashed. Daenerys felt her mind lurch, as though she were pulled into another realm. She sensed them both. Rhaegal's raw anger, Viserion's tortured confusion. She poured all her love, all her remorse, into that psychic link. They had to know she was still their mother, still the source of their first warmth. She told them she was sorry for the pain, for the horrors they had witnessed and endured, for the ways she had used them as instruments of war without fully considering their spirits. She promised them a new beginning, if only they would come. For a moment she felt them respond. Like children brushing against a mother's womb, they acknowledged her presence. But then came a searing rejection, a red-hot wave of fury. Rhaegal's scorn burned her mind while Viserion's twisted torment threatened to drag her into a frosty abyss. She felt them slip away from her mental grasp. She cried out, tears of blood running from her nose. Tasha's chanting faltered. The glyphs dimmed. Daenerys collapsed onto the cold stone, her body convulsing in pain. Tyrion rushed to her side, shouting for help. Davos glared at Tasha with wrathful suspicion. The sorceress simply lowered her arms, her expression solemn. "It appears they will not come," Tasha said quietly, as the last echoes of magic faded in the cavern. "Their hearts are closed to you." Days passed as Daenerys recovered from the ordeal. The ritual had failed. Her bond with Rhaegal and Viserion was not restored, and now she carried a deep ache inside her soul, as if she had lost them all over again. Tyrion tried to console her, citing that dragons could be unpredictable, that perhaps in time they would return willingly. Davos took a more pragmatic approach. "If they remain hostile," he said gently, "we must consider how to protect the realm." Daenerys understood what he meant. A pair of untamed dragons rampaging across Westeros would only sow further destruction. Some might see them as a plague and move to kill them. And if Rhaegal and Viserion were truly lost to her, would she be forced to do the unthinkable and slay her own children to save thousands? She could not accept that fate. She set out again, ignoring the physical and mental exhaustion. Winter's chill was closing in, the days shorter, the nights colder. The men were nearing their limit, but she pushed them onward with a quiet desperation. At last, one morning, scouts spotted the dragons perched together on a remote peak that overlooked a frozen lake. Daenerys' party crept up a rocky ridge, seeking vantage. Sure enough, Rhaegal and Viserion were there, huddled close as though forging a final alliance. Drogon was nowhere to be seen. Daenerys stood on a neighboring ridge, the wind biting her cheeks, her heart racing. She saw Rhaegal's green scales marred by fresh wounds, likely inflicted by Drogon in their clashes. She saw how Viserion's breath iced the air in front of him, as though torn between living fire and the cold curse that had once bound him. A swirl of wind stirred the snow, and Daenerys caught a glimpse of movement near the dragons. Half buried in the snow lay the remains of some large creature, perhaps a bear or a direwolf. A kill. They were feeding. That meant they were strong enough to hunt, strong enough to survive. But would they abandon her forever, or worse, see her as an enemy? She signaled for her men to remain behind, taking only Tyrion and Davos. She began a careful descent into the icy valley, approaching the frozen lake. Each step felt like stepping closer to doom, but she had no choice. If there was even a chance to reach her children, she had to try. Thunder rumbled overhead, and snow began to fall. Rhaegal's head snapped up, and Viserion turned as well, both alert. They watched Daenerys approach with unblinking eyes, their nostrils flaring. She stopped at what she judged was the closest safe distance. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she spread her arms wide, letting them see she carried no weapon. Tyrion and Davos lingered a dozen paces behind, swords at their hips but sheathed. The dragons rumbled, tails lashing, uncertain. Daenerys let the silence stretch, then spoke softly in Valyrian. "My children," she said, voice trembling. "I know you are angry. I know you have suffered. But we do not have to be enemies. Let us find a way to heal. You are free, yes, and I will not bind you again. But do not turn against me. I cannot bear it." She took a tentative step forward. Rhaegal snarled, a menacing rumble that vibrated the air, but Viserion tilted his head, as though curious. The pale dragon opened his jaws slightly, exposing rows of dagger-like teeth. Daenerys' pulse pounded. She forced herself not to move. She reached out, as if offering her hand, though she was still many yards away. It was a gesture of trust, the way she had once approached them, as hatchlings. And in that moment, from the clouds above, Drogon descended like a thunderbolt. His roar tore through the thin mountain air. Rhaegal and Viserion spun, wings flaring in alarm. Drogon slammed into the ice at the shore of the lake, sending cracked spiderwebbing across the surface. Snow billowed in great gusts around him. Daenerys threw up an arm to shield her face. When she looked again, she saw Drogon standing between her and the other two dragons, his black scales bristling, blood still crusted on his wounds. His eyes blazed with protectiveness, as though he would stand as her champion whether she wished it or not. Rhaegal roared in challenge, stepping forward, jaws snapping. Viserion hissed, pale wings spreading. Drogon responded with a torrent of his bright orange flame, scorching the ground at their feet. Rhaegal and Viserion reared back, then unleashed their own blasts of fire. Rhaegal's emerald flame, Viserion's tortured mix of heat and ice. The air erupted in a swirl of conflicting energies. The shockwave shattered the frozen lake, sending chunks of ice spinning through the air. Daenerys was knocked to her knees. Tyrion and Davos ducked behind a boulder as shards of ice rained down. The dragons fought yet again, locked in a cataclysmic struggle. They whipped across the lake, smashing into rocky outcroppings, breathing flame and frost, raking claws. Daenerys watched in horror. She wanted to scream for them to stop, but her voice was lost in the maelstrom. Some primal part of her recognized that this was not just a physical battle. The souls of the dragons themselves warred over loyalty, freedom, vengeance, a swirl of instincts too vast for mortal minds to fully comprehend. And in this cosmic dance, Daenerys was but a catalyst. For long minutes, the chaos raged. Drogon grappled Rhaegal in midair, sending them both crashing down onto the fractured ice. Viserion seized the opportunity, diving in to rake Drogon's flank. Drogon bellowed, whipping his tail to knock Viserion aside. Rhaegal blasted Drogon with green fire. Drogon responded with a roar that shook the cliffs. Snow melted and refroze in erratic patterns. Chasms of scorching steam belched from the ice. Rocks crumbled from the surrounding slopes. All the while, Daenerys clung to hope that they would not destroy each other. She tried to stand, but the wind and the shockwaves battered her back to the ground. Then, in one heart-stopping instant, she saw Drogon clamp his jaws around Viserion's neck, a gout of black blood mingling with shimmering frost. Viserion shrieked and retaliated, snapping at Drogon's shoulder. Their bodies thrashed, writhing in a deadly embrace. Rhaegal lunged, tearing Drogon away from Viserion, saving his pallid sibling from a fatal bite. Drogon spat fire at Rhaegal, scorching his wings. Viserion, wheezing and bleeding, struggled to rise, frost forming along his wounds. Daenerys knew in her marrow that this battle might end in all their deaths. Then something snapped inside her. She refused to let this happen. Gathering all her courage, she seized a spear from the ground, one of the men's weapons left in the snow. She stumbled forward onto the lake's icy edge, calling Drogon's name. A half-broken chunk of ice shifted beneath her feet. Drogon, in the midst of clawing at Rhaegal, turned his head at her call. Rhaegal took the opportunity to rake his claws across Drogon's side, drawing a fresh roar of pain. But Drogon shook him off, battered him with a wing, then lurched back. For an instant, all three dragons paused, circling each other warily. Daenerys stood, trembling, on a cracked shelf of ice, arms raised. "Stop!" she screamed, as loudly as she could, her voice raw. "Stop this madness." The dragons turned their gazes on her. She felt the power of their stares, a chaotic swirl of love, hate, confusion, bloodlust, pain, betrayal, longing, guide. "If you must kill someone," she cried, "kill me. End it here. But do not kill each other." For a moment, all she could hear was the howling wind. Rhaegal and Viserion exchanged a look, or so it seemed, as though communicating with that silent language only dragons knew. Drogon crouched, ready to defend Daenerys. Then Rhaegal and Viserion inhaled deeply, twin jets of fire flickering in their throats. Daenerys stared, tears streaming down her cheeks. Certain this was the end. Tyrion and Davos watched from behind the rocks, helpless. The dragons unleashed their flames not upon Daenerys, but upon Drogon. The combined blasts of green fire, and that strange icy flame, struck Drogon full in the chest. Drogon roared in agony, releasing his own fire in retaliation, but he was overwhelmed by the dual assault. The force of it threw him back across the ice, scorching and freezing him in the same violent instant. Daenerys screamed, rushing forward without thought for her own safety. Drogon slid on the ice, steaming blood pouring from his wounds. His tail lashed weakly. Rhaegal and Viserion roared in unison, a chilling harmony, then lifted off, beating their wings until the winds whipped into a gale. Within seconds, they vanished into the swirling snow, leaving Daenerys kneeling beside her dying dragon. She cradled Drogon's massive head, ignoring the heat and the stench of burned flesh. He let out a ragged growl, his eyes rolling to meet hers. She remembered the day he had hatched, the moment she had first ridden him through the skies of Essos, every triumphant victory they had shared. She remembered how he had always come for her when she called, how he had saved her at the great pit of Daznak, how he had scorched her enemies time and time again. Now, all that power slipped away, undone by his sibling's wrath. Daenerys pressed her forehead to Drogon's, tears spilling onto his scales. "It's all right," she whispered, voice trembling. "Mother is here." Drogon's breathing slowed. She felt his great heart shudder. His wing twitched, lifting slightly, as though trying to shield her from the cold. Then his body went limp. The last breath escaped his mighty chest. Daenerys felt something inside her break, a final chord of her soul snapping in two. She gasped, sobbing, pressing her face against his lifeless scales. The cold wind howled around them. She did not know how long she stayed like that. Tyrion and Davos eventually dared to approach, bowing their heads at the fallen king of dragons. The men who remained from her retinue formed a wary circle, grieving silently, though they had no words to offer. Davos knelt by Daenerys, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, my queen," he said softly, voice thick with sadness. Tyrion only stood in stunned silence, tears lining his own cheeks. He had come to believe, despite everything, that Daenerys' bond with Drogon was unbreakable, that no matter how dark her path might become, Drogon would stand at her side. Yet now, Drogon was gone. Daenerys lifted her head slowly, her expression a mask of grief and fury. She could still see the dark shapes of Rhaegal and Viserion in the clouds above, heading deeper into the mountains. They had chosen their own path, and it led to Drogon's death. Now they were truly lost to her. A terrible calm settled over Daenerys, colder than any winter storm. She rose unsteadily, leaning on Davos for support, her eyes distant. Tyrion, seeing that vacant stare, feared the worst. Davos cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we must get you to shelter before the cold claims you." She nodded absently, turning her back on Drogon's body at last. But before she took a step, she knelt once more, pressing her bloodied palm to the still warm scales. Closing her eyes, she offered a silent farewell, a wordless promise. Then she stood. "Burn him," she said in a hollow tone. "Use what remains of our oil and wood. Let him depart as a king." Davos nodded, though his expression was grim. Tyrion gave orders to the men. They gathered tinder, broken wood, anything flammable. Soon, they had built a mighty pyre around Drogon, though it paled in comparison to the size of the dragon's body. Daenerys watched with empty eyes as torches were cast, flames licking up the scales. Snow melted away in a widening circle. The heat forced the men to back off. Daenerys stood as close as she could, letting the flames warm her numb face. In the swirling embers, she saw every victory, every tragedy, every bond she had forged with the dragons. Drogon had been her greatest champion, and now he was gone. That night, Daenerys did not sleep. She stood vigil until the pyre burned down to smoldering embers. Her mind churned with thoughts of Rhaegal and Viserion. Could she truly blame them? They had been twisted by war, by sorcery, by her own ambition. She had once dreamed of conquering Westeros to save it, but in that dream, had she not also used her children as weapons? Perhaps they had grown to resent that purpose, to reject a mother who had unleashed fire on a city of innocents. Or maybe they were simply lost, the pains of the world too great for them to bear. At the first light of dawn, Tyrion and Davos approached her with solemn faces. "Your Grace, we must return south," Tyrion began gently. "You have no dragons left to protect you now. The realm is, well, it's in turmoil, to put it mildly. We cannot linger here." And Daenerys' voice was raw from weeping. "I still have Rhaegal and Viserion." she muttered, though even she did not believe that fully. Davos placed a careful hand on her arm. They have turned against you, my queen. We do not know if they will ever come back. But if you die here, the realm will be thrown into chaos again. We must see to your safety, and then we can decide how to handle those two. Daenerys stared at the ember-laden snow. She wanted to chase after Rhaegal and Viserion, to throw herself into a final confrontation. But what good would that do? Drogon's broken body had shown her the futility of direct force against two rebellious dragons. And a small voice in her mind reminded her of the visions she had seen during Tasha's ritual. Visions of a realm consumed by dragonfire. Maybe this was her punishment. Maybe she would never again ride a dragon's back. In the end, she nodded, allowing her men to guide her away from the cold mountains and the smoking remains of Drogon's funeral pyre. They began the journey south, battered by grief, weighed down by the knowledge that Rhaegal and Viserion soared somewhere over Westeros, motherless, leaderless, full of fury. The future looked uncertain, overshadowed by the promise of dragonfire that could rain down at any moment. Word of Drogon's death spread before Daenerys, carried by frightened travelers who had seen the pyres glow in the distance. By the time she and her retinue reached Winterfell again, rumors abounded that the dragons had turned on their mother, that the Targaryen line was cursed, that the realm would soon be rent by the monstrous fury of the two renegades. Lords whispered that Daenerys was now vulnerable, though she still possessed the Unsullied and a fraction of the Dothraki. Some wondered if this was the time to rise against her. Others feared that provoking her would only draw Rhaegal and Viserion into a new wave of destruction. Daenerys carried herself with a new, cold resolve. She appeared before the nobles of the north, refusing the great hall's seat of honor, standing instead as she delivered the news. 2 dragons lived, but had broken with their mother. Drogon, the mightiest, had fallen. There were gasps and murmurs, fear etched across every face. She did not offer them false hope. Instead, she said that she would see to it that the realm was prepared. If Rhaegal and Viserion threatened the north, or any part of Westeros, she would muster what forces she had to defend the people. But how? Demanded Lord Glover, voice trembling. If we could not stand against one dragon, how can we stand against 2? Daenerys turned her gaze upon him. Her grief had honed her into something fierce and hollow at once. We will do what we must, she said simply. We have the Scorpion's Qyburn built, designs that can be improved. We have the cunning of Tyrion Lannister, who outwitted many foes. We have the bravery of you all. Dragons may be powerful, but they are not invincible, as my Drogon's death has shown. I would rather find a peace with them, but if they leave us no choice, then we defend ourselves. Memsha. She left the lords to their mutterings. She had little interest in their politics now. All she wanted was to retreat from the gaze of the world, to bury her grief in some dark corner. But she was queen, for better or worse, and the realm demanded leadership. Over the next few weeks, she worked with Tyrion and Davos, relaying the knowledge she had of dragons, how they hunted, how they might be tracked, their vulnerabilities. She commanded the forging of new ballistae, improved with lighter steel and advanced pivot mechanisms, based on the designs that had once wounded Drogon. She urged the lords to train archers with harpoons, to store large caches of grain in fortified keeps, and to fortify their walls. The irony of teaching Westeros how to slay dragons, creatures she had once believed would be her salvation, was not lost on her. But she no longer had illusions. Rhaegal and Viserion had effectively declared war on their mother by killing Drogon, or at least taking part in it. Seasons passed in a tumult of uncertainty. The winter proved harsh, blanketing the land in snow, slowing the movement of armies and delaying building projects. But the threat of Rhaegal and Viserion overshadowed even the cold. Occasionally, ravens arrived from distant outposts, reporting sightings of emerald wings and ghostly pale shapes in the sky. Whole villages were found burned or frozen, their livestock gone. Some believed that the 2 dragons fought each other as often as they attacked humans, caught in an endless cycle of aggression. Others whispered they were raising clutches of eggs, forging a new brood to overthrow the realm. No one knew for sure. The storms of winter made travel and scouting dangerous, and the dragons themselves were elusive, driven by instincts no mortal fully understood. Daenerys remained at Winterfell for a time, forging uneasy alliances with northern lords and occasionally dispatching envoys south. King's Landing, still under partial reconstruction, lay vulnerable to any direct attack. Grey Worm sent word of progress on new defenses, but moral weariness gripped the city. They had not forgotten the day Daenerys laid waste to their streets, nor had they forgiven. Fear was all that kept them from open rebellion. Daenerys felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. She wondered if she should relinquish the throne altogether, retreat to some distant corner of the world. But that would leave Rhaegal and Viserion unchecked, and her sense of responsibility, for them, for the realm, would not allow her to flee. The day finally came when word arrived that Rhaegal and Viserion had been sighted near the Trident, a vast swath of farmland crucial to feeding the populace. They had apparently set fire to storehouses before drifting away, leaving peasants to starve. In a fit of rage, Daenerys gathered her captains. "We march," she said. "We will find them, or drive them away from the farmland. They will not starve this land." She led a small but determined force south, braving treacherous roads and freezing sleet. Along the way, more reports reached her of burned fields and flash-frozen rivers. Farmers cowered in half-buried huts, terrified. Some tried to follow Daenerys' army in hopes of protection, but she had few supplies to spare. Bitter guilt gnawed at her. These were the very people she had once wanted to liberate. Now they were caught in the crossfire of her war with her own children. When she arrived at the banks of the Trident, the devastation took her breath away. Acres of farmland had been reduced to ash and ice-laden craters. She recognized the patterns of destruction. Rhaegal's green fire, Viserion's unnatural frost. Smoke clung to the sky, mingling with swirling snow. Tyrion and Davos surveyed the wreckage, grim-faced. That evening, as they made camp near the charred remains of a barn, Daenerys stood alone on a small rise, staring into the darkness. She felt older than her years, weighed down by sorrow. She no longer wore the bright Targaryen dresses of old. Her attire was fur-lined, practical, a queen in winter's embrace. A swirl of snow danced around her boots. She closed her eyes, recalling the day she first soared on Drogon's back, the wind in her hair, the taste of freedom. How had it come to this? Hunting her own dragons across a ruined land. A shape passed overhead, blocking the moonlight. Daenerys' heart lurched. Rhaegal or Viserion? She looked up. Tyrion, a dozen paces behind, let out a soft cry of alarm. A monstrous silhouette circled above the campsite. Shouts rang out. Men scrambled for the newly fashioned scorpions and ballistae. Daenerys clutched the hilt of a sword at her side, though she knew it was useless against a dragon's hide. Torches flared, revealing the gargantuan form of Rhaegal, his wings beating the cold air, scattering snow. He circled once, letting out a roar that shook the ground. Then, abruptly, he shot a column of green fire into a cluster of tents. Soldiers screamed as flames consumed them. Chaos erupted. Men fired ballista bolts that whistled through the night. Rhaegal dodged most with uncanny agility, though one bolt grazed his flank, drawing a shriek of pain. He turned to unleash more fire, raking the camp with flame. Horses bolted. Tents collapsed in burning heaps. Daenerys rushed into the fray, shouting for her men to hold formation to angle the scorpions upward. Tyrion and Davos sprinted to coordinate the defense. The sky glowed with dragonfire, shimmering against falling snow. Then came a second roar, higher-pitched, echoing through the darkness. Viserion swooped in, frost-laden breath colliding with the flames, exploding in a cloud of steam that scalded men alive. Screams tore through the night. The dragons soared above, weaving around each other, not in conflict, but in a strange, unified dance of destruction. They set upon the baggage wagons, ripping them apart to get at supplies, or simply out of raw aggression. Fire and frost battered the ground. Soldiers fumbled with ballista cranks, trying to line up shots in the chaos. Daenerys' vision blurred with tears as she watched her own children lay waste to her camp. In that moment, the final shred of hope that they might peacefully reconcile died in her heart. She knew she had to make a choice. Let them ravage the land unchecked, or do everything in her power to stop them, even if it meant their deaths. Her people, those who still clung to her cause, were dying by dragonfire. It was the same plight the people of King's Landing had once faced beneath Drogon's wrath. Had she not learned from that mistake? Summoning her courage, she rushed to a scorpion mounted on a wagon bed. The crew there had been scattered by an icy blast from Viserion. She scrambled up, pushing aside a man's frozen corpse, and seized the lever. With Tyrion's help, she began to crank the mechanism, aiming the bolt skyward. Rhaegal, swooping in for another pass, roared across the campsite. Daenerys' heart pounded. Could she really do this? Could she kill her own child? But her men were screaming, burning, dying. She had no choice. Her grief burned away, replaced by the icy calm of necessity. She locked eyes on Rhaegal's approaching form, waited for the moment when he was near enough for the shot to matter, ignoring the hot tears on her cheeks. Tyrion shouted instructions, but she barely heard him, focusing only on the movement of Rhaegal's wings, the angle of his approach, the glimmer of fire building in his throat. At the last second, she pulled the release lever. The scorpion bolt launched with a thunderous snap, cutting through the sky. Rhaegal tried to bank away, but the bolt struck true, piercing his side. His roar turned to a shriek. Green flames erupted from his jaws in all directions, engulfing part of the wagon, and forcing Daenerys and Tyrion to leap clear. They hit the ground hard as the wagon exploded in a swirl of fire and splintered wood. Dazed, half-deafened, Daenerys rolled onto her back. She saw Rhaegal spiraling overhead, spewing blood and flame. He crashed down beyond the camp with an earth-shaking impact, sending up a plume of snow and debris. A ghastly silence followed. Viserion let out a shrill cry that sounded almost mournful, then tore across the sky in a fury, blasting the camp below with frost-laden fire. Soldiers scattered. Scorpions tried to track him, but he was too fast. He scooped up one ballista in his claws and hurled it aside like a toy. Men died left and right. Daenerys coughed, trying to rise, to see what had become of Rhaegal. But Viserion descended in a rage, slamming into the ground near her. His pale form loomed, steam rolling off his body. Blood trickled from old wounds, but he was still terrifyingly powerful. He roared at Daenerys, his breath forming crystals in the night air. She stared up at him, battered and aching, her cloak singed, her hair matted with soot. Viserion advanced, jaws parted. Tyrion scrambled to pull Daenerys back, but the dragon's tail lashed out, knocking Tyrion aside like a rag doll. Daenerys tried to crawl away, but the icy ground offered no friction. Viserion pinned her beneath a massive claw, pressing down just enough to hold her in place. She felt the weight crushing her ribcage, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked into the pale, haunted eyes of her once beloved child, seeing no hint of the gentle creature that once curled in her lap as a hatchling. He inhaled, chest expanding with lethal purpose. Daenerys shut her eyes, prepared to die at the jaws of her own dragon. But something made him hesitate, some flicker of memory, or perhaps the bond they once shared. She felt his hot, ragged breath washing over her, smelled the mix of rot and sulfur. Then, with a roar, he hurled her aside instead of torching her outright. She rolled across the snow, gasping as her battered body screamed in pain. Viserion prepared to unleash a final blast, his jaws opening wide. Daenerys struggled to rise, lifting a trembling hand in a futile gesture of supplication. A thunderous roar echoed through the chaos. Rhaegal, mortally wounded but not yet dead, hurled himself back into the fray. He slammed into Viserion, and the two dragons crashed in a tangle of wings and claws. Daenerys scrambled away, half-blind with tears. Soldiers renewed their attacks, launching bolts at both dragons, though few shots landed cleanly in the swirling confusion. The two dragons tumbled together, hissing and snapping, trailing blood across the ground. Rhaegal, impaled by the scorpion bolt, struggled for every breath, but he fought with a desperate ferocity. Viserion unleashed an icy plume that froze part of Rhaegal's wounded side, But Rhaegal latched onto Viserion's throat with his jaws, ripping at the old necrotic wounds. Viserion screeched, flailing his wings, scraping furrows in the earth. Daenerys watched with horror and heartbreak, unable to intervene. She realized with sudden clarity that this was their final battle. There would be no peace, no redemption. The children she had once nurtured were locked in a death spiral. Flames, frost, roars, and the snapping of bone filled the night. Then, in one terrible instant, Rhaegal tore out Viserion's throat in a welter of blood and frost. Viserion's final scream echoed into the cold sky. He collapsed, pale wings splayed, body twitching. Rhaegal staggered back, green fire flickering from his jaws. He looked up, meeting Daenerys' eyes across the battlefield, and in that moment, she saw a glimmer of recognition, a memory of the bond they had once shared. Then his limbs buckled. The scorpion bolt and his many wounds had taken their toll. With a final trembling breath, Rhaegal collapsed onto the snow, his massive body slumping over Viserion's. The battlefield fell silent, save for the crackle of lingering fires and the moans of the wounded. Daenerys, numb and shaking, forced herself to stand, to move toward the fallen dragons. Tyrion emerged from behind a scorched wagon, limping and clutching his side, tears streaking his face. Davos found them, face pale, shock and sorrow etched into his features. Together, they approached the ruin of what had once been three magnificent creatures. Rhaegal and Viserion lay dead, their forms twisted and broken. Smoke and steam rose from their wounds, mingling in the icy air. Daenerys could not contain her sobs. She fell to her knees in the bloody snow, pressed her hand to Rhaegal's cooling flank, then to Viserion's. She felt the same emptiness she had felt when Drogon died, but now multiplied. Her children were gone. The dream of House Targaryen restored through dragons was over. Tyrion stood beside her, silent, tears wet on his cheeks. Davos bowed his head, murmuring a prayer for the dead. Soldiers approached with caution, uncertain how to react to the carnage. Daenerys looked up at the sky, at the swirling snow tinted by the distant glow of flames. She remembered how once she had soared on dragonback, convinced she would change the world for the better. She had changed it, perhaps, but not for the better. She whispered a silent apology to Rhaegal and Viserion. They had not asked for war. They had simply been born into it, shaped by forces beyond their comprehension, by her quest for a throne, by the magic of the Night King, by the cruelty of men. There would be no final flight for the Mother of Dragons. She bowed her head over Rhaegal's still form, letting the grief overtake her. All three were dead now, and she was alone in a realm that feared her, with no living dragons to call her own. The wind keened across the plain, as though lamenting the passing of an age. In the distance, the waters of the Trident flowed, indifferent to the blood soaking its banks. Daenerys closed her eyes, remembering a time when she had been called Stormborn, breaker of chains, the unburnt. Now in this bitter winter, she was just a woman kneeling in the bloodied snow, mourning the children who had once called her mother. She did not know what lay ahead, only that she would carry this grief for as long as she lived. And she prayed that wherever dragons soared after death, her three might find some peace in that distant sky, far from the mortal failings of the world below.